The world was noise and motion. Iron wheels screamed against iron rails, a rhythmic, grinding chant that vibrated up through the floorboards, through the soles of Etta's worn-out shoes, and into her very bones. Dust, fine as flour and the color of rust, danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the carriage's gloom, coating every surface, including the back of her throat. Each lurch of the train was a jarring reminder that she was trapped, a rat in a rolling cage, and the hunters were in the cage with her, behind her. She heard them, not their words, not yet, but the heavy, purposeful thud of men's boots, so different from the scuff of a farmer or the click of a town dweller's heel. This was the sound of pursuit, a relentless beat that matched the frantic hammering in her chest. There were 3 of them. She hadn't dared to look back since El Paso, but she knew their sounds, their smells. One wheezed with every other step, a thick, wet sound. Another smelled of cheap whiskey and unwashed wool. The third, the leader, was quiet, but his silence was the most terrifying thing about him. It was a patient silence, the kind a spider practices in its web. She stumbled through another coupling, the wind and noise exploding around her for a brief second, whipping her honey-colored hair across her face and stealing the breath from her lungs. She pushed through the door into the next car. It was a passenger car, half filled with slumped figures trying to sleep through the heat of the Arizona territory. A woman in a black bonnet looked up, her eyes lingering on Etta's torn sleeve and the wild fear in her face, before pointedly turning to stare out the window at the blur of saguaro and rock. No help there. No one ever wanted to see trouble. They wanted to believe it didn't exist until it was standing on their own throat. Her father had taught her that lesson well. The boots were closer now. She could hear the wheezing man cough, a hacking sound that made her stomach clench. She pushed onward, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch of the next door. It groaned open, revealing the final car on the train. It wasn't a passenger car. It was for freight, mostly empty save for a few stacked crates in the vast, hollow space. And him. He sat on a low crate in the far corner, away from the door, a silhouette against the harsh light of the afternoon. He was large, not in a soft, fleshy way, but in the way of an old oak tree, all dense muscle, broad shoulders, and solid presence. A wide-brimmed hat, stained by sun and sweat, was pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. He wore a heavy greatcoat of dark wool, impossibly thick for the desert heat, a garment that spoke of cold nights in the mountains and a life lived far from the comforts of a hearth. He was so still he seemed a part of the car itself, another piece of cargo being shipped from one desolate place to another. Etta's heart seized. This was it, the end of the line. There was nowhere else to run. The man didn't move, didn't seem to have even registered her frantic entrance. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. For a terrifying second, she thought her only hope was a man who was either blind or dead. Then he shifted, just a fraction, and she saw the glint of his eyes under the hat's brim. They weren't dead, they were watchful, the color of a winter sky, and they took her in with a slow, unnerving calm. His face, what she could see of it, was carved from hard country. Lines etched around his eyes and mouth told of squinting into 1,000 suns and holding back 1,000 words. It was a face like stone, showing no pity, no curiosity, and no welcome. The boots slammed into the connecting passage behind her. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Etta's veins. She had no time for pride, no time for propriety. She scrambled across the swaying floor, her worn skirt catching on a splinter. She fell to her knees before him, the impact jarring her teeth. "Please," she whispered, the word a ragged puff of air. Her voice was raw, unfamiliar to her own ears. "Mister, please, they're coming for me." The man didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He just watched her, his expression unchanging. She could feel the seconds stretching, thinning, about to snap. She could hear the men arguing just outside the door, their voices muffled but laced with a cruel confidence. Tears she had refused to shed for 200 miles burned her eyes. "Please, just hide me," Just for a minute. She looked at the heavy coat, the only possible sanctuary in this barren space. It was a mad thought, a child's notion of safety. She was 18 years old, a woman grown. Yet in that moment, she wanted nothing more than to be small, to be invisible, to disappear into the dark. "Under your coat," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please." He looked down at her, a girl on her knees before him, her face streaked with grime and terror. He saw the tremble in her hands, the desperate plea in her wide, blue eyes. He saw the ghost of a bruise on her cheekbone, faint but undeniable. He took in the simple, homespun dress, made for a life of quiet chores, not a frantic chase across the territory. He didn't know her story. He didn't need to. In his world, there were two kinds of people, the hunters and the hunted. The choice of which side to stand on was the only one that ever truly mattered. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't ask her why she was running or who she was running from. Questions were baggage, and he traveled light. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement that was utterly silent, he leaned forward slightly. He took the worn leather edges of his greatcoat in his big, calloused hands and simply pulled them apart. It was an invitation into the dark. For a heartbeat, Etta just stared. Then the door handle behind her rattled, and the spell was broken. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward, ducking her head and curling herself into the smallest possible shape. She pressed herself against his legs, tucking her knees to her chest, and he let the heavy wool fall, shrouding her completely. The world vanished. All light was extinguished, replaced by an absolute blackness that smelled of dust, worn leather, horse, and the faint, clean scent of the cold night air that clung to the fabric. The roar of the train was muffled, a distant thunder. She was cocooned in warmth, the solid columns of his legs a wall against her back, the thick fabric a roof over her head. She held her breath, trying to silence the frantic beat of her own heart, which she was sure he could feel against his shins. The carriage door slammed open, banging against the interior wall. The sudden, violent sound made her flinch, and she felt the muscles in the man's legs tense in response. "Right. Where is she?" It was the voice of the man with the stained vest. "Silas, rough and impatient. Can't have gone far. This is the end of the line. Maybe she jumped," wheezed the second man. "Bart, crazy girl. All that fuss over nothing." Heavy boots stomped on the wooden floorboards, the sound alarmingly close. Etta squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face against the rough denim of the cowboy's trousers. "She ain't jumped," said the third voice, the quiet, chilling one that belonged to Cletus. "She's in here. I can smell her. Smells like fear and preacher's soap. A crate scraped against the floor. They were searching." Etta's breath hitched. She fought to control it, to draw in air silently through her nose and let it out in a slow, measured stream. The man she was hiding under remained a statue. Not a single muscle twitched. He was breathing. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of it through his legs, but it was the calm breathing of a man asleep, not one with a terrified girl at his feet and 3 dangerous men in his presence. "Well, look what we have here," Silas sneered. The footsteps had stopped directly in front of them. Etta could picture them, looking down at the big man on his crate, taking in his size and his silence. Just a sleeping cowpoke. Hey, you wake up." There was no response. "Maybe he's seen her," Bart wheezed. "Give him a shake." There was a scuff of a boot, and then Etta felt a slight jostle as one of them likely shoved the man's shoulder. The pressure was absorbed without effect. It was like shoving a boulder. A long, tense silence followed. Etta could feel the man above her shift his weight, a minute adjustment that seemed to draw all the energy in the car toward him. "I said," Silas repeated, his voice louder now, tinged with irritation. "We're looking for a girl, about so high, yellow hair. You see her come through here still." The man, her protector, said nothing. His silence was a weapon. It was unnatural, defiant. It unnerved them. Etta could tell. They were used to people who cowered, people who answered, people who were afraid. This man was none of those things. "Are you deaf?" Friend Cletus's quiet voice was like ice. "Or just stupid a girl? Runaway. Belongs to a man in El Paso. There's a reward for her return." The mention of a reward hung in the air. This was the moment of truth. A man like this. A lone rider. He could always use money. He had no reason to protect her. A stranger who had literally fallen at his feet. A few silver dollars for turning her over. It was the sensible play. Etta's blood ran cold. She prepared for the coat to be ripped away, for the harsh light and the cruel faces to reappear. She felt his body shift again. This time it was more pronounced. He wasn't preparing to move or stand. He was settling. He was planting himself more firmly, becoming more immovable. He was drawing a line on the floor of that train car. And these men were on the wrong side of it. "Look, we don't want no trouble with you, mister," Silas said, his bravado beginning to crack. "Just tell us if you saw her. We'll be on our way." From inside her dark haven, Etta felt a deep vibration begin in the man's chest. It traveled down through his body, a low rumble like distant thunder. It wasn't for them. The words, when they came, were spoken softly, meant only for the space beneath the coat, for the ears of the trembling girl hidden there. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. It was the first sound she had heard him make, and it was a promise. "Under my coat," he said, "the words a quiet decree. You don't answer to no one." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was not a suggestion or a threat to the men. It was a statement of fact, a law he had just created in this small corner of the world. The girl was under his protection, and their authority, their pursuit, their very existence, ended at the edge of his shadow. Outside the coat, the silence was deafening. Etta could imagine the three men looking at each other, weighing the silent, massive figure before them. They had come for a scared, fleeing girl. They had not expected to run into a mountain. A man who would not speak to them, would not look at them, but would shield a stranger for no reason they could understand. That kind of man was unpredictable, and unpredictable men were dangerous. "Forget it," Cletus muttered, his voice sharp with frustration and a hint of something else, reluctance, perhaps even a sliver of fear. "She ain't worth a bullet. We'll find her in the next town." The heavy boots shuffled, turned. Etta heard them retreat, their footsteps quickening with their failure. The carriage door was wrenched open one last time and then slammed shut, the sound echoing in the now empty space. They were gone, but Etta didn't move. She remained curled in the darkness, her cheek pressed against his leg, listening. The only sounds were the unceasing rhythm of the train and the slow, steady beat of the man's heart, a rhythm that now felt like the most profound declaration of safety she had ever known. He hadn't moved. The coat remained her shield. The world held at bay by a wall of quiet, stubborn wool. She stayed there, breathing in the scent of dust and leather, hidden in the shadow of a stranger who had spoken no name, but had offered her everything. The train did not so much arrive as give up. It groaned to a halt with a final, shuddering sigh of steam, leaving behind the rhythmic clatter of the rails for a profound and oppressive silence. When Jed Holt rose, the movement was so fluid for a man his size that it seemed the train car had simply fallen away from him. He pushed open the heavy door, and the heat rolled in like a physical blow, thick and tasting of baked earth. He stepped out onto the splintered planks of the depot platform without a word, and after a moment's hesitation, Etta followed, a ghost slipping out of a shadow. The world outside the train was a glare of white-hot light. She squinted, her hand flying up to shield her eyes. After the gloom of the carriage, the Arizona sun was blinding, bleaching all the color from the world and leaving only stark shapes and deep shadows. The town of San Abeno was little more than a single, dusty street baked into the desert floor, a collection of tired-looking wooden buildings that seemed to be leaning on each other for support against the vast, empty sky. A hot, dry wind whispered down the street, kicking up little dust devils that danced and died in the heat. Jed went to the stock car, his boots making solid, unhurried thuds on the platform. Etta lingered a few feet behind him, feeling small and terribly exposed. He worked the latch with practiced ease and let out a rangy, dark bay horse. The animal was as lean and weathered as its owner, with intelligent eyes that took in the sorry-looking town and seemed unimpressed. Jed ran a hand down the horse's leg, feeling the worn iron of its shoe. He grunted, a low sound of confirmation. This was the reason for their stop. The horse needed seeing to. He looped the reins over his arm and started walking. Etta, having nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to, fell into step behind him, her gaze fixed on the broad expanse of his back. It was the only landmark she had in this strange, hostile new world, and the town began to watch. It started with a man lounging in the sliver of shade offered by the general store's awning. He was whittling a piece of wood, but his knife stilled as they passed. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, left Jed and settled on Etta, tracing her path from head to toe with a slow, insolent appraisal. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His gaze was a brand, marking her as something new, something out of place. As they walked the length of the street toward the blacksmith's forge at the far end, the silent scrutiny spread like a contagion. A woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window paused, her arms frozen mid-shake, her face a pale, curious oval in the dark square of the window. Two children, playing with marbles in the dirt, stopped their game and stared with the frank, unnerving intensity of the very young. From the swinging doors of the saloon, the tinny sound of a piano faltered and died. Faces appeared in the gloom, pale and watchful. Etta pulled the thin fabric of her dress closer to her body, though the heat made the gesture absurd. She felt the weight of their eyes like a physical touch. They saw everything. They saw the weariness in her walk, the tremor in her hands. They saw that her dress, though dusty and creased from her journey, was made of finer cotton than what the local women wore. They saw that her hands, though grimy, were not chapped and calloused from a life of hard labor. They saw her youth, the clear skin beneath the dirt, and the fear she couldn't quite hide. But most of all, they saw her walking behind Jed Holt. They saw a great silent wolf leading a stray lamb, and their minds, starved for incident, began to churn. Jed seemed oblivious to it all. He walked as if the street were empty, his gaze fixed forward, his stride even and measured. He was a man accustomed to being alone, and the presence of others was no more consequential to him than the flies that buzzed in the air. He was a self-contained world, and for now, she was the only other inhabitant. The blacksmith was a heavy, sweat-soaked man with arms like tree trunks. He nodded at Jed, a greeting between men who understood the language of work. "Loose shoe on the front left," Jed said, his voice the same low rumble she remembered from the train. "And the back right's worn thin as a dime. Can fix it." The blacksmith grunted, wiping his brow with the back of a sooty hand. "But it'll take the afternoon. Got a wagon wheel ahead of you. You can leave him in the corral." Jed nodded once. He led the horse to the small, fenced-in area beside the forge and expertly slipped off the bridle. The horse immediately lowered its head to a trough of murky water. Jed watched it for a moment, then turned his gaze back toward the town. Etta was still standing where he'd left her, a small, solitary figure in the middle of the dusty street. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then jerked his head toward the building across from them. The sign, its paint faded and peeling. Red, boarding house saloon, clean beds, cold beer. It was a command, not an invitation. Etta hurried to his side, and they crossed the street together. As they stepped up onto the boardwalk, the whispers finally found her. They came from two women sitting on a bench outside the saloon, fanning themselves with folded pieces of paper. Their voices were low, meant to carry only to each other, but the dry air held the sound. "Look at that. Never seen her before. Came in on the train with him. Saw him from my window. She don't look like his kind. She's clean." The word hung in the air, weighted with suspicion. It wasn't a compliment. In a place like San Abeno, to be clean was to be untested, to be soft, to be from somewhere else. It meant you didn't belong. Jed pushed through the saloon doors without breaking stride. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. It was cooler. The gloom a welcome respite from the sun. A few men sat at tables, nursing drinks, and every single one of them looked up as Jed and Etta entered. The silence that fell was heavy and complete. Jed ignored them, walking to the bar where a stout woman with a severe bun and a disapproving face was wiping a glass. Her name was Agnes, and her establishment was the town's nerve center. "A room," Jed said, "for the girl, and a plate of whatever's hot." He placed $2 on the worn wood of the bar. Agnes's eyes flicked from Jed to the money, and then to Etta, who stood hesitantly by the door. Her gaze was sharp and missed nothing. She took in Etta's appearance. The fine spun dress, the delicate line of her jaw, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. Agnes had seen 100 girls pass through this town, and she prided herself on being able to read their stories in a single glance. She took the money. "Room's upstairs, end of the hall." She turned and yelled toward a back room, "Martha, plate for the girl." Then she leaned slightly over the bar, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp meant for Jed alone. "That girl's trouble. Mister, I can smell it. She's clean, too clean." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "A preacher's girl. Maybe. Run off from the fear of God. Or worse." She let the word hang with grim satisfaction. "A virgin running from sin. Either way, she'll bring a storm down on whoever's with her." Jed's expression didn't change. He took the iron key Agnes slid across the bar and turned to Etta. He didn't speak, but his look was enough. "Go away!" Etta fled, her cheeks burning. She hurried up the rickety staircase, the whispers of the saloon patrons feeling like barbs in her back. The hallway was narrow and dark, and the room at the end was little more than a cell, containing a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a pitcher and bowl on a rickety stand, and a single small window looking out onto a dusty alley. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. She closed the door, leaned her back against it, and for the first time in 2 days, allowed herself to breathe. Downstairs, Jed took a seat at a corner table, his back to the wall, a position that allowed him to see both doors. He didn't order a drink. He just sat, waiting, a silent monument of patience. The murmur of conversation in the saloon slowly returned, but it was different now, circling around the topic of the strangers. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Jed left the saloon and went to check on his horse. He was running a hand over the new shoes, the iron still warm from the forge, when a man stepped out from the shadows of the livery. He was older, with a leathery face and a drooping mustache, a cattleman by the look of his worn chaps and spurs. He held a half-smoked cigarette in his fingers and looked at Jed with an expression that was not quite friendly. "That's a fine piece of horseflesh," the man said, nodding toward the bay. Jed grunted in acknowledgement but didn't reply. The man took a drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out slowly. "A man who knows horses knows they need a firm hand. Can't be too gentle, can't be too rough. Gotta know what you're doing." He paused, letting his meaning sink in. "Some things are like that, especially women." Jed remained silent, his attention seemingly fixed on his horse's flank. The man took another step closer, his voice lowering. "I seen the girl you brought into town. The whole town's seen her, and I'm telling you, as one man to another, you're riding into a canyon with no way out." He gestured with his cigarette toward the boarding house. "That girl ain't meant for a man like you. She's too untouched, too breakable. She's the kind that gets inside a man's head, makes him do foolish things. She'll ruin you if you touch her. Not with a gun or a knife, but with tears and trouble and the law that always follows girls like that. Take my advice. Get on your horse, ride out, and don't look back." The man finished his speech and waited, expecting an argument, or a threat, or at least a response. He got none. Jed Holt slowly straightened up from his horse. He turned his head and looked at the cattleman. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held no anger and no fear. They were flat, calm, and utterly resolute. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The man's warning, the town's whispers, the judgment in Agnes's eyes, they were all just noise, like the wind that blew through the desolate streets of San Abeno. They meant nothing. He held the cattleman's gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and looked up at the window at the end of the hall in the boarding house, the one that belonged to Etta's room. His gaze lingered there, and in that look, there was no calculation of risk. There was no weighing of advice. There was no hint of a man who was planning to run. There was only the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had made a choice on a swaying train car in the middle of the desert, and saw no reason on earth to unmake it now. The room in the boarding house was a cage, and Etta knew it. A cage with a lock on the inside, but a cage nonetheless. The window offered a view of nothing but a sun-baked alley and the indifferent wall of the building next door. She had spent the rest of the day there, listening to the muffled sounds of the town, the occasional shout from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a passing wagon, and every sound was a reminder of the eyes that had watched her arrive. She was a specimen, a curiosity pinned to a board for the whole town to examine. When the knock came, it wasn't a sharp rap, but a dull, solid thud, as if a fist had met the wood without malice, simply announcing a presence. She knew it was him. She opened the door to find Jed Holt filling the narrow hallway, his sheer size seeming to shrink the space around him. He didn't speak. He just held up the iron key to her room, then gestured with his head for her to follow. She didn't question it. She took her small, pathetic bundle of belongings, a spare shift, and a small Bible she had tucked into her dress before she fled and followed him down the stairs. He didn't lead her through the saloon, where the drinkers were now louder and more numerous, but out a back door that led directly into the alley. The heat of the evening was still immense, the dust of the day settling in the purple twilight. He walked past the main livery and toward a smaller, older structure at the very edge of the property, a long-neglected barn that leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. He slid open the heavy, groaning door, and the familiar, comforting scent of dry hay, horse, and old leather washed over her. It was the first thing that had felt honest and real since she'd left home. Inside, the barn was cavernous and dim, shafts of dying light cutting through the gaps in the plank walls, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Jed's horse and two others were in stalls, their soft munching and the swish of their tails the only sounds. He led her to a clean, empty stall at the far end. Without a word, he began to work. He forked fresh, sweet-smelling hay from a loft, piling it thick in the corner. He shook out two heavy horse blankets, one to lay over the hay and one to serve as a cover. It was a makeshift bed, a pallet on the floor of a stable, but he built it with a quiet, methodical care that spoke volumes more than words ever could. It was not a bed of comfort, but it was a bed of safety. It was a space he controlled, far from the prying eyes and whispering mouths of San Abeno. "This'll do," he said, his voice low in the quiet barn. It wasn't a question. It's fine," Etta replied, her own voice a small thing in the vast space. "Thank you." He gave a short, barely perceptible nod and turned to his own gear, which was piled near the entrance. He had his own bedroll, a simple canvas-wrapped bundle he would likely lay out on the dirt floor. He was establishing a boundary, her space. His space, a clear, unspoken line drawn in the dirt between them. She was just about to arrange her meager belongings when a small sound from the shadows made her start, a flicker of movement. She tensed, her heart leaping into her throat, the fear of pursuit still a living thing inside her. But it wasn't one of Cletus's men. A small boy, no older than 7, stepped out from behind a stack of barrels. He was all sharp angles and oversized clothes, with a thatch of dusty brown hair and eyes that were too big and too old for his face. He held a half-eaten apple in one hand and looked from the silent, imposing figure of Jed to the startled girl by the hay pile. He was unafraid, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. He pointed the apple at Etta. "You, his wife?" he asked, his voice clear and high. The question was so direct, so innocent. It broke through the tension like a stone through thin ice. A laugh escaped Etta's lips before she could stop it. It was a strange, rusty sound, as if her own joy was a foreign language she was just remembering how to speak. The sound seemed to surprise even her. She looked at Jed, who had turned his head slightly, his face in shadow but his attention clearly on the exchange. Then she looked back at the boy and offered him a small, genuine smile. "Not yet," she said softly. The boy, whose name she would learn was Benji, seemed to accept this as a perfectly reasonable answer. He took another crunchy bite of his apple and regarded them both with the solemn air of a tiny judge. Benji was a town orphan, a piece of driftwood who had washed up in San Abeno and made the barn his unofficial home, doing odd jobs for the blacksmith and Agnes in exchange for scraps and the freedom to be left alone. He was part of the barn's inventory, and he seemed to have decided that Etta and Jed were, for the moment, acceptable additions. The next day passed in a slow, silent rhythm. The sun beat down on the barn roof, filling the space with a drowsy, baking heat. Jed worked on his saddle, which had a strap that was beginning to fray. He sat on an overturned bucket, his large hands surprisingly deft with the awl and waxed thread. Etta watched him for a long time from her corner. She saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the patient, repetitive motion of his work. He was a man who knew how to fix things that were broken. Finally, the idleness became too much to bear. She was not used to being useless. At home, her hands were always busy with mending, baking, or tending the small garden behind the parsonage. She stood up and walked over to him, her shadow falling across his work. He looked up, his pale eyes questioning. "I can sew," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My stitches are small." He considered her for a moment, his gaze dropping to her hands. They were clean and soft, not the hands of a woman used to heavy leather work. But he saw the determination in her face, the need to be doing something, anything, to feel a sense of purpose. He handed her the needle and the strap without a word. Her first few stitches were clumsy. The thick leather resisted the needle, and she pricked her finger more than once, a small bead of red welling up on her fingertip. But she didn't give up. She pressed on, her movements growing more confident, her stitches becoming a neat, tight row beside his larger, more practical ones. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of the needle, the soft breathing of the horses, and the distant, muted life of the town. Later, she helped him clear out old, soiled hay from a vacant stall, her arms aching from the unaccustomed weight of the pitchfork. She learned to fill the water troughs, the cool splash of the water a relief against her skin. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was working. She was contributing. She was earning her small corner of the barn. And with every task, she felt a piece of her own strength returning. Jed never thanked her, but when she brought him a dipper of fresh water, he took it and drank, his eyes meeting hers over the rim for a fraction of a second. It was enough. As evening fell, the world changed. The sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue all day, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a hot, lazy breath, began to pick up, whining through the cracks in the barn walls. "Storm's coming," Jed stated, looking out the main door. "A bad one." He and Benji, who had reappeared as if by magic, worked to secure the barn, barring the main door and stuffing rags into the larger gaps in the walls. The air grew thick and heavy. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that was steadily rising in pitch. Then came the sand. It started as a soft hiss, like 1,000 whispering voices. Soon, it became a roar, a relentless, scouring assault against the old wood of the barn. The world outside disappeared into a churning, brown chaos. Sand found its way through every tiny crack, stinging their skin and gritting between their teeth. The temperature dropped, and the barn, once a haven of warmth, became a pocket of darkness besieged by the screaming wind. Benji, his earlier bravado gone, curled up in an empty grain bin and fell asleep. The horses shuffled nervously in their stalls. Jed sat with his back against the wall, his hat pulled low, a figure of absolute calm in the heart of the tempest. Etta retreated to her corner, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. The storm raged for hours. It was an elemental fury that stripped away all pretense, leaving only the darkness, the noise, and the two of them, isolated from the rest of the world. In the maelstrom, the whispers of the town seemed a distant, foolish thing, but they had taken root in Etta's mind, watered by her own fears. The town had judged her. They had judged him. They had decided who she was and what she would bring him ruin. She lay in the dark, listening to the shrieking wind and the steady, quiet sound of Jed's breathing. He was so solid, so sure. He had faced down 3 armed men for her. He had endured the town's judgment for her. He had given her a safe place to sleep. He had let her work alongside him, and he had asked for nothing in return. Why was Agnes right? Was the cattleman right? Was she a danger to him simply because of what she was or what she wasn't? The questions churned inside her until she couldn't bear the silence between them any longer. "Jed," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. She saw his head lift slightly in the gloom. She took a shaky breath, the words tasting like dust in her mouth. "They say I'm too pure for a man like you." Her voice trembled. "The woman in the saloon, the man by the corral, they say I'm trouble. They warn you about me." She paused, gathering all her courage for the final, terrifying question. "Are they right?" Silence. The wind howled, rattling the barn door in its frame. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Etta's heart sank. His silence was an answer in itself, a confirmation of her deepest fears. She was a fool, a burden. She closed her eyes, shame and despair washing over her. Then he moved. He didn't just speak from the shadows where he sat. He rose, a great dark shape unfolding in the gloom, and took 2 slow steps toward her, moving out of the deeper darkness and into the faint ambient light filtering from some unknown crack. He was still just a silhouette, but he was closer now, a presence that felt both immense and incredibly gentle. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was as quiet as the heart of the storm, a calm space in the middle of the noise, and it wasn't directed at the town, or at her past, or at the labels they had tried to place on her. It was directed only at her. "I don't listen to people," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the raging dark. "I listen to you." Jed's words in the storm had been an anchor, but the calm that followed was a fragile thing. The sandstorm had scoured Sanabeno clean, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a town that felt scrubbed raw. For 2 days, a quiet routine settled in the barn. Etta mended Jed's spare shirt with her small, neat stitches. Jed repaired a broken hinge on the barn door. Benji watched them both with his old eyes, a silent observer of the strange, nameless family that was forming in the hay-scented dimness. It was a peace so profound it felt like a held breath, and Etta knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it could not last. Her past rode in on a tired-looking sorrel mare late on the 3rd afternoon. The rider was not a man of brute force like Cletus or his companions. This one was different. He was lean and dressed in dark, well-fitting clothes that seemed out of place in the dusty town. He had a narrow, intelligent face with a neatly trimmed mustache and cold, methodical eyes that missed nothing. He didn't swagger into the saloon or make a show of his arrival. He dismounted, tied his horse to the rail in front of the sheriff's empty office, and moved with the quiet efficiency of a hawk circling its prey. From the shadows of the barn, Etta saw him, and a familiar, icy dread washed over her. She didn't know the man, but she knew his kind. He was a professional. He unrolled a piece of paper from his saddlebag and, with 2 sharp taps of a hammer, nailed it to the wooden post outside the office door. Then he simply stepped back, crossed his arms, and waited, confident that the town's curiosity would do the rest of his work for him. It didn't take long. First came the blacksmith, wiping his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed. Then Agnes, the saloon owner. came out, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of sour vindication. The cattlemen who had warned Jed drifted over from the livery. Soon, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs a low buzz that carried on the hot, still air. Benji, who could move through the town unseen, slipped out of the barn and crept close to the gathering. He returned minutes later, his face pale, the apple in his hand forgotten. He didn't look at Etta, he looked at Jed, who was checking the bay's new shoes. "Mr. Holt," the boy said, his voice a tight whisper. "There's a paper with her name on it." He knew. Jed stopped what he was doing and slowly straightened up. He looked at Etta. Her face had gone as white as bleached bone. All the life and warmth that had begun to return to her over the past few days had vanished, leaving only the hunted look he'd first seen on the train. "What does it say, Benji?" Jed asked, his voice calm and even. "It says, Etta Marlin," the boy recited, the words sounding strange in his childish voice. "Wanted for breaking a contract, for fleeing a lawful union. It says there's a reward from a man in El Paso named Corbin Vance." Corbin Vance. The name fell into the quiet of the barn like a stone into a well. Etta flinched as if struck. The buzz from the street was growing louder now. It was the sound of a verdict being passed. Jed walked to the wide barn door, standing just inside the shadow, and looked out at the small crowd. They weren't looking at the poster anymore. They were looking this way, looking at the barn, at him, at her. The town with eyes had found its focus. "I knew it," Agnes's voice carried, sharp and triumphant. "Trouble," said it from the start. "She ain't just some runaway preacher's girl. She's a promise breaker, belonging to a rich man, by the sound of it." "Corbin Vance," the cattleman's voice rumbled. "I've heard that name. A man who owns half of El Paso. Not someone you want to cross. The girl must have done something serious for him to send a bounty man after her." A few of the men started to walk toward the barn, not with overt aggression, but with a new, firm purpose. They were men of order, men who believed in contracts and property. A woman who broke a marriage agreement was no different to them than a horse thief. She had violated a law, written or unwritten, and the balance had to be restored. The bounty hunter, seeing his work was done, pushed off from the wall and started toward them, his path set to intercept Jed. "Stay here," Jed said to Etta, his voice low. He didn't look at her, but the command was absolute. He stepped out of the barn, into the full, harsh glare of the afternoon sun, positioning himself directly in the path of the approaching townsman and the bounty hunter. The lean man stopped a few feet from him, his cold eyes taking in Jed's size and his unyielding stance. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "Jedediah Holt, I believe," the bounty hunter said, his voice smooth and cultured. "My name is Kane. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Corbin Vance of El Paso. It seems you're harboring his property." He gestured with his thumb toward the darkness of the barn. "The girl, Etta Marlin. There's a legal contract, signed and sealed. She's his intended wife. She fled the night before the wedding. I'm here to escort her back." The townsmen gathered behind Kane, their faces set and grim. "He's right, Holt," one of them said. "It's the law. A contract is a contract. You can't just interfere in another man's business." "Give her up," Agnes called from the boardwalk, "before she brings real trouble down on all of us." Jed's gaze didn't waver from Kane's face. The sun beat down on his shoulders. The dust was still. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. He had no gun in his hand, no weapon at his side. He just stood there, a wall of flesh and bone and unshakable will. "She ain't property," Jed said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. Kane's smile tightened. "It's a matter of legal definition. Holt, not sentiment, Mr. Vance paid a considerable sum to her father for the arrangement. She belongs to him until that contract is fulfilled at the altar. I have the papers right here. I'm acting as an agent of the law." He made a show of patting his coat pocket, letting the threat of legal authority hang in the air. He was trying to corner Jed. to make this a fight not against one man, but against the abstract power of law and order. Jed looked past Cain, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the men from Sanabeno. He saw their fear, their suspicion, their rigid belief in a world where everything had a price and every deal must be honored. And then he spoke, his words simple, direct, and utterly devastating to the bounty hunter's legal posturing. "She ain't a criminal," Jed said, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs. "She's just running from a man who don't understand, no?" The words landed in the dusty street and silenced everyone. He had reframed the entire situation. He had stripped away the legal language of contracts and property and revealed the simple, brutal truth at its core. This wasn't about the law. It was about a woman's right to say no and a man's refusal to hear it. He made the men of Sanabeno look not at a fugitive, but at their own wives, their own daughters. Cain's face hardened, the veneer of civility cracking. That's a dangerous way of thinking. Holt, it invites chaos. The law is what keeps us from being animals. Sometimes the law is what lets the animals feel like men, Jed countered, his voice flat. "She's under my protection. You ain't taking her." It was a declaration of war. Cain stared at Jed, his cold eyes calculating the odds. He saw a man who would not be moved by words, by threats of law, or by the pressure of a crowd. He would have to be moved by force. And Cain was not a man who enjoyed a fair fight. He preferred the odds stacked in his favor. For now, they were not. "This isn't over," Cain said softly. A promise and a threat. He turned and walked back toward the saloon, the crowd parting before him. The townsmen hesitated, looking from Jed's implacable figure back to the bounty hunter, their certainty shaken. For now, the confrontation was over. Jed had won. He stood there for a long moment, watching them disperse, before turning and walking back into the cool, dark sanctuary of the barn. Etta was where he had left her, pressed back against the rough wood of the stall, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her whole body was trembling. He walked past her and began to check the straps on his saddle, his movements as calm and deliberate as before, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The fragile peace was shattered. Her past had a name, a face, and a price, and he had just put himself between it and her. She owed him the truth, all of it. "My father," she began, her voice a ragged whisper. The words felt like stones in her throat. "He's a preacher, or he was. He has a weakness for drink and for cards." Jed continued his work, not looking at her, but she knew he was listening. His stillness was a form of listening, more intense than any direct gaze. "He got into debt," she continued, her eyes fixed on the dusty floor. "A deep debt to Mr. Vance. Corbin Vance owns the largest saloon in El Paso, the Crystal Palace. He owns many things. He's a powerful man, a man who collects beautiful things." She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "My father had nothing left to pay him with. No money, no property. So he offered me." The confession came out, shameful and ugly. "Mr. Vance had seen me at the church social. He told my father he would cancel the entire debt in exchange for my hand in marriage. A contract. My father signed it." She finally looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "Jed, he isn't a good man. Corbin Vance. The stories they tell about him. About the women who work in his saloon. About his temper. He buys what he wants, and he breaks what he buys. I couldn't. Tears she hadn't shed in front of the town, or the bounty hunter, or even in the lonely darkness of her flight, now welled in her eyes. The night before the wedding, he sent over a dress. It was white satin, covered in pearls. It felt like a shroud. My father was drunk, celebrating his good fortune. I waited until he passed out. I took what little money I had saved from my mending work, and I just ran until I found the train station." She finished, her story laid bare in the quiet barn. She had told him the worst of it, that she was not just a runaway, but a commodity, sold by her own blood. She waited for his judgment, for the disgust, for him to finally tell her that she was too much trouble, that he was done. Jed finished tightening a buckle on his saddle. He tested it with his thumb. Then he slowly turned and looked at her. His face held no pity, no surprise, no disgust. There was only a deep, quiet understanding, the look of a man who had seen the world for what it was and was not surprised by its ugliness. He walked over to the water barrel, dipped the ladle in, and held it out to her. "Here," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "You're thirsty." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a promise of eternal protection. It was a simple, practical act of care. It was a drink of water in the middle of the desert. And in that moment, it was everything she needed. He knew her story, and he was still there. He hadn't run. The bounty hunter, Cain, did not leave San Abeno. He took a room at the boarding house, the one directly above the saloon, and there he remained, a patient spider in his web. His presence was a poison that seeped into the town's air. Every time Etta caught a glimpse of his lean figure on the boardwalk, a cold knot of fear would tighten in her stomach. He never approached them, never spoke. He simply watched, his cold eyes a constant reminder that the flimsy piece they had found in the barn was borrowed time. Jed seemed to take no notice, yet his actions spoke of a subtle shift. He was no longer just waiting for his horse to be ready. He was preparing for a storm. On the fourth morning, after Benji had scampered off to do his chores for Agnes, Jed walked to his saddlebags and pulled out a Colt revolver, heavy and dark. He checked the cylinder, his movements economical and precise. He then took out a small, worn leather pouch of ammunition. He walked over to where Etta was mending a tear in one of the horse blankets. He didn't say a word, just held the gun out to her. "Handle first." Etta stared at it. The gun was an object from a world she'd only ever prayed to be delivered from. It was a thing of violence, of noise and finality. In her father's house, such things were spoken of as the tools of sinners and devils. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I've never even held one." "I know," Jed said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "That's why you're going to learn." His hand remained steady, offering the weapon. It was not a request. He was telling her a truth of her new life prayers were not enough to stop a man like Cain, or a man like Corbin Vance. She had run, and that was a start. But now she had to learn how to stand her ground. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the gun. The weight of it shocked her. It was heavier than she could have imagined. A solid, dense piece of iron that felt cold and dead in her palm. Her hand immediately began to tremble, not just from the weight, but from the sheer, terrifying potential of the thing she held. "Your finger stays on the outside," Jed instructed, his voice low and close as he knelt beside her. He gently repositioned her hand, his large, calloused fingers covering hers for a brief moment. His touch was firm and impersonal, the touch of a teacher, yet the warmth of it sent a jolt through her. "Right there. It don't move until you're ready to fire. You understand? That's the most important rule. You point it at something. You best be ready to destroy it." He led her out behind the barn, to a spot sheltered from the town's view by a rocky outcrop. He set up a rusty can on a fence post 50 feet away. He showed her how to stand, how to hold the gun with both hands to steady it, how to line up the sight at the end of the barrel with her target. "Breathe out slow," he said, his voice a calm rumble beside her ear. "And don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it, like you're squeezing water from a cloth. A slow, steady squeeze. The bang should surprise you." Etta lifted the gun. Her arms shook, the can wobbling in and out of her sight. The world seemed to shrink to just that small, distant piece of metal. She thought of Cletus's cruel face on the train, of Cain's cold eyes, of the life that awaited her in El Paso. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that slammed into her ears and shuddered up her arms. The gun kicked back hard, wrenching her wrists. When she opened her eyes, the can was untouched. A puff of dust had kicked up in the dirt a good 10 feet to the left of it. The smell of sulfur filled the air, acrid and sharp. Her hands were shaking so badly now she could barely hold the pistol. Again, was all Jed said. They spent an hour like that. She fired again and again, the recoil jarring her, the noise making her flinch. Most of her shots went wide, kicking up dust in a wide, scattered pattern around the can. Frustration and shame burned in her cheeks. She was weak, clumsy, a preacher's daughter who knew how to embroider and bake bread, not how to fight. "I can't do it," she finally said, her voice thick with unshed tears as she lowered the heavy gun. "My hands, they won't stop shaking." "Your hands are shaking because you're thinking," Jed replied, his gaze on the can. "You're thinking about the noise, about what it means to hold this. You're thinking about him. He didn't have to say Cain's name. Stop thinking. Just look at the can. There's nothing in the world but you, this gun, and that can. Now, raise it up." She did as he said, her arms aching. She breathed out, trying to empty her mind of everything but his voice. She looked at the can, a simple, ugly piece of rust in the bright sun. She squeezed the trigger, slowly, steadily. The bang still surprised her, but this time, a loud ping echoed in the quiet air, and the can leaped off the fence post, spinning end over end before landing in the dust. Etta stared, her mouth slightly open. A strange, fierce feeling shot through her, a hot, unfamiliar spark of triumph. She had done it. She had made her mark. It was a small, insignificant thing, a can on a post, but it was something. She looked at Jed. His expression was unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his pale eyes. Approval. He took the gun from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Enough for today," he said, and walked back toward the barn. In the afternoon, the small triumphs continued. Benji appeared with his only spare shirt, a garment so gray with dirt it was hard to tell its original color. Etta, seeing the state of it, felt a surge of purpose. She took the shirt, a bar of harsh lye soap from Jed's supplies, and a bucket, and went to the public well in the center of town. She tried to make herself small, to ignore the stares she knew were on her. She worked the pump, the iron handle stiff and screeching, and filled the bucket. She scrubbed the small shirt against a worn washboard she found nearby, her knuckles growing raw. The work was hard, but it was honest. As she scrubbed, she saw a woman watching her from the doorway of the general store. It was the woman from the saloon porch, the one who had judged her the first day. The woman leaned over to her companion, her hand covering her mouth, but Etta heard the words drift across the dusty street as clearly as if she'd whispered them in her ear. "Look at her, washing the orphan's clothes, settling in. She's playing wife already." The words were a slap. They took her small act of kindness and twisted it into a performance, a calculation. They reduced her to a role, a type. The woman who tames the wild man, who builds a nest, who claims her territory through domestic service. Etta's cheeks burned with a hot, angry shame. She finished her task, her movement stiff, and carried the now clean shirt back to the barn, hanging it on a rope to dry in the sun. She had not been playing anything. She had simply seen a child with a dirty shirt. Was the world so small, so mean, that it could not understand such a simple act? That evening, she decided to cook. Jed had bought flour, beans, and a small slab of bacon. Using a blackened pot and a small fire Jed built just outside the barn doors, she made a simple meal of beans and fried bacon, with rough biscuits cooked in the skillet. It wasn't much, but as the smell of frying bacon and baking bread filled the air, something in the tense atmosphere began to soften. Benji appeared, drawn by the scent, his eyes wide. They ate in silence around the small, crackling fire as the sun set and the sky filled with a spray of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Benji ate hungrily, his face smeared with grease. Jed ate slowly, methodically, his gaze fixed on the flames. The simple, shared act of eating a hot meal under the vast, open sky felt more like home than anything Etta had ever known. After Benji curled up in his grain bin to sleep, Etta and Jed sat by the dying fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on his stone-carved face. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken events of the day. The gunshot, the whispered judgment, the shared meal. The town saw her as a woman playing wife. But what did he see? What did he think of this girl who had stumbled into his life, a girl defined by her past, by her flight, by the very innocence the town seemed to mock and fear in equal measure? She had to know. The question had been building in her all day, a pressure behind her ribs. She looked at his profile against the flames, the hard line of his jaw, the steady calm in his eyes. "Jed," she said, her voice soft. He didn't turn, but she knew he was listening. She took a breath, steeling herself. "The town, they call me pure. Agnes said it. That man by the corral said it. The bounty notice. It's all about a wedding that didn't happen." She stared into the fire, the words coming out in a rush before her courage could fail. You've lived a life. I can see it. You've been places. You've known other women," she faltered, her throat suddenly tight. This was more intimate than the gunshot, more terrifying than the bounty hunter. "I was wondering," she whispered, her gaze still fixed on the glowing embers. "Jed, you ever been with a virgin before?" He remained perfectly still, his eyes on the fire. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the wood and the distant cry of a coyote. She held her breath, expecting silence, or a dismissal, or a gruff word to tell her it was none of her business. She had crossed a line, and now he would push her back, retreating into his fortress of solitude. But when he spoke, his voice was a low, steady rumble, devoid of judgment or surprise. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the flames, as if the answer was not in his past, but in some simple, elemental truth he found there. "That don't matter," he said. "Only thing that matters is if she wants to be touched." Jed's words by the fire had answered a question Etta hadn't truly known how to ask. They had settled something deep inside her, a quiet affirmation that she was more than the label the world had given her. That night, for the first time, sleep in the barn felt less like hiding and more like resting. The darkness was a blanket, not a shroud. The horse's soft snuffling was a lullaby. She, Jed, and Benji were a small, silent island in the heart of a sleeping town. But the world outside the barn had not been sleeping. It had been waiting. The first sound was wrong. It wasn't the creak of old wood settling or the scuff of a horse's hoof. It was a soft, grating noise from the back of the barn, near the small, high window that was never used. Etta, drifting in the shallow sea of near sleep, heard it and her eyes snapped open. In the deep shadows across the way, she saw a shape detach itself from the darkness. It was Jed. He was already awake, already moving. A silent predator who had sensed a disturbance in his territory. He didn't reach for his Colt. He picked up the heavy shotgun that had been leaning against the wall near his bedroll. He moved with a liquid grace that defied his size, melting into the deeper shadows by the stalls. He held up a hand, a gesture Etta understood in her bones. "Stay down, stay quiet." Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She reached out in the dark, her hand finding Benji's small shoulder under his thin blanket. The boy was still asleep. She held her breath, listening, every nerve ending alight. A muffled curse, quickly stifled. The sound of a boot scraping on wood. They were inside, not one, but several. A floorboard groaned near the back wall. Then, a voice, dripping with smug satisfaction, cut through the darkness. Well, not exactly the Crystal Palace, is it? Bart. It was Silas, the loud-mouthed one from the train. A wheezing laugh answered him. "Smells better, though." Jed didn't move. He was waiting, letting them reveal themselves, letting their arrogance make them clumsy. A match scraped, and a tiny flame flared to life, held in the hand of the third man. Cletus. His face was a yellow, skull-like mask in the flickering light. His eyes, small and cunning, swept the barn, passing over Etta's and Benji's huddled forms, and settling on the empty bedroll where Jed should have been. "Looks like the big man ain't home," Silas sneered, stepping more confidently into the center of the barn. He was holding a length of thick rope. "Makes this easier. Just here to collect the bride, mister. Kane sends his regards," Cletus said, his voice a soft, chilling purr. He took a step toward Etta's stall. "He's a patient man, but his patience has run out. And so has Mr. Vance's. Time to go home. Little girl." He took another step, and that's when Jed moved. He didn't shout a warning. He simply materialized from the shadows behind Silas. A force of nature. The barrel of the shotgun came up, not to fire, but as a club, and slammed into the side of Silas's head with a sickening thud. The man dropped without a sound, the rope falling from his limp fingers. Bart, the wheezing man, yelped and fumbled for a pistol in his belt, but Jed was already on him. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it with brutal efficiency. A bone snapped with a wet, popping sound, and Bart screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony as the pistol clattered to the floor. It was fast, brutally efficient, and for a second, Etta thought it was over. But Cletus was not a fool like the others. While Jed dealt with Bart, Cletus had faded back, pulling his own gun. He didn't fire. He used it as Jed had, as a weapon of blunt force. He lunged from the side, swinging the heavy pistol butt in a vicious arc. Jed, still entangled with the screaming Bart, turned just in time to see it coming, but not in time to avoid it completely. He threw an arm up, but the blow was too powerful. The steel barrel caught him high on the temple. The sound was a dull, heavy crack, like a stone splitting wood. Jed staggered. A low grunt was forced from his lips. His legs, which had seemed as solid as oak trees, buckled beneath him. He fell to one knee, shaking his head as if to clear it, one hand rising to the side of his face. When he pulled it away, it was dark with blood in the faint moonlight now filtering through the open door. Cletus smiled, his teeth a white slash in the dark. "Not so big now. Are you?" He raised the pistol to strike again. In that moment, something inside Etta broke. The fear was still there, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but something else rose up to meet it. It was a hot, white rage. She saw Jed on his knee, wounded, vulnerable. She saw the cruel, triumphant look on Cletus's face. And she saw Benji beside her, now awake, his small body trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. They were going to kill him, and then they were going to take her. And the boy would see it all. No, the word was not spoken. It was a fire that ignited in her soul. She remembered the weight of the Colt in her hand, the recoil, the slow, steady squeeze. "There's nothing in the world but you. This gun, and that can—" She scrambled across the hay, her hands finding the cold, smooth wood of the shotgun Jed had dropped when he was struck. It was impossibly heavy, a dead weight, but she lifted it, her arms, which had ached from holding the small pistol, now strained with the weight of the much larger weapon. She rose to her feet, a small, trembling figure in a simple cotton dress, holding a weapon of terrible power. The twin barrels of the shotgun seemed to suck all the light from the barn. Click-clack. The sound of her thumbing back the hammers was shockingly loud in the sudden silence. It was a sound of absolute finality. Bart stopped his whimpering. Cletus froze, his pistol still raised over Jed's head. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. A look of disbelief, followed by amusement, crossed his face. "Well, now," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look what the cat dragged in. The little church mouse wants to play. Put that down, girl, before you hurt yourself." Etta's hands were shaking violently. The end of the shotgun barrel traced a wild, unsteady circle in the air. Her heart was a drum beating a frantic rhythm of war. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the gun, to run, to hide. But she didn't. She held her ground, her knuckles white on the stock. She saw Jed trying to push himself up, only to slump back down. his strength failing him. Cletus took a step toward her, his confidence returning. I said, "Put it down." "You don't have the stomach for this." He was wrong. She didn't have the stomach for killing, but she was discovering she had the stomach for something else. For protecting. Cletus saw his words weren't working. His eyes flickered past her, to the small, terrified shape huddled in the hay of the stall. A new, uglier kind of cunning lit his face. He changed his target. He let the pistol in his hand drop, and in the same motion, drew a long, thin knife from his belt. The blade caught the moonlight, a sliver of cold fire. He turned his back on Etta and took one deliberate step toward Benji. "Maybe you don't care about the big man," Cletus purred, his voice like poison. "Maybe you're right to let him die, but what about the boy? You want to see what this knife can do to a face as soft as his, and then it happened." The shaking stopped. It didn't just lessen, it ceased completely, as if a switch had been thrown inside her. The frantic trembling in her arms vanished, replaced by a strength she didn't know she possessed. The wild beating of her heart slowed to a cold, steady, and purposeful rhythm. The world, which had been a blur of fear and shadow, snapped into sharp, clear focus. She saw the glint of the knife. She saw the genuine terror on Benji's face. She saw the dark stain of blood spreading in Jed's hair. And she saw Cletus, a monster who would use a child to get what he wanted. The girl who had run from El Paso. The girl who had hidden under a coat. The girl who had flinched at the sound of a gunshot was gone. In her place stood someone else. She lifted the shotgun until the twin barrels were aimed squarely at the center of Cletus's chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the quiet, hesitant whisper he had heard before. It was as cold and hard as the packed earth of the barn floor. It was the voice of a woman who had drawn a line, and he had just crossed it. "Touch him," she said, her words clear and ringing in the dead quiet of the barn. "And I'll bury you right here." There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of a bluff. It was a simple statement of fact. Cletus stopped dead. He looked over his shoulder, into her eyes. He had expected to see fear, hysteria, tears. He saw none of those things. He saw a blue-eyed calm that was far more terrifying than any rage. He saw a woman who had measured the cost and was willing to pay it. He saw his own death in her eyes. He was a bully and a predator, but he was not a fool. He knew the look of a person who had been pushed past their breaking point. He hesitated for a long, silent moment, the knife still in his hand. The only sound was the pained breathing of the man on the floor with the broken wrist. Then, with a motion that was almost too quick to see, he slid the knife back into its sheath. "It ain't worth it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He kicked at Bart. "Get up." "Get him!" He gestured toward the unconscious Silas. Bart, clutching his broken arm, scrambled to obey. Together, they dragged Silas's dead weight toward the door, their arrogance and cruelty replaced by a sullen, hurried fear. At the doorway, Cletus paused and looked back at Etta, who had not lowered the shotgun by an inch. "This ain't over," he spat, but the words were hollow. The threat of a dog that had been whipped, then they were gone, swallowed by the night. The silence that rushed back in was immense, ringing with the echoes of violence. For a full minute, Etta didn't move. She just stood there, the shotgun held steady, her gaze fixed on the empty doorway. Then, slowly, as if waking from a dream, she lowered the heavy weapon. The smell of blood and sweat and fear filled the air. Benji was crying. Small, choked sobs in the hay. Jed was stirring, trying to push himself up, his face a mask of pain. Blood was dripping from his head onto the dirt floor, but they were alive. They were safe. Etta looked down at her hands, still clenched around the shotgun. They were steady, rock steady. The world had come for them in the night, with rope and steel, and she had not broken. She had not run. She had stood her ground, and she was not shaking anymore. The echoes of the violence faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound. For a long moment, The world consisted only of 3 broken figures in the gloom, a man bleeding in the dirt, a boy sobbing in the hay, and a girl holding a shotgun. The cold weight of the weapon was the only thing that felt real. Then, the world came rushing back. The adrenaline that had turned Etta's limbs to steel drained away, leaving a bone-deep weariness and a tremor that started in her hands and spread through her whole body. She carefully, deliberately, uncocked the shotgun's hammers and leaned it against the stall. Her first thought was not for herself. She scrambled over to Benji, who was curled into a tight ball, his face buried in the hay. She gathered him up, his small, trembling body feeling as fragile as a bird's. "Shh," she whispered, her own voice sounding strange and raw. "It's over now. They're gone. We're safe." She held him close, rocking him gently, her hand stroking his dusty hair. He clung to her, his tears soaking the front of her dress, but his sobs slowly quieted into hiccuping breaths. Her eyes went to Jed. He had managed to push himself into a sitting position, his back against a post. His head was slumped forward, and the dark blood that had trickled from his temple was now a thick, ugly smear down the side of his face and into his beard. He was conscious, but barely. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The sight of him, so powerful and now so broken, cut through her exhaustion and ignited a new, fiercer kind of urgency. She settled Benji back into the hay with a blanket. "Stay here. I need you to be a brave soldier and watch over our fort. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, his eyes huge and dark in his pale face. He watched her, his small protector, as she turned to face the crisis. Etta went to Jed's side. "Jed," she said softly, touching his shoulder. He flinched, a low groan rumbling in his chest. His eyes, when he tried to open them, were unfocused, the pupils strangely dilated. The blow had been worse than she thought. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly shoved it down. Panic was a luxury. It was the province of the girl she used to be. The woman she was becoming had work to do. She needed light and water. She found Jed's lantern and, with trembling hands, managed to light the wick. The small, steady flame pushed back the shadows, revealing the full extent of the chaos: the overturned bucket, the dropped rope, the dark splotches of blood on the packed earth, and the gash on Jed's head. It was deep, swollen, and still weeping blood. She took a bucket to the well, her movements stiff but purposeful. The town was dark and silent. No one came out. No one offered help. It was as if the barn and everyone in it had ceased to exist. They were on their own, back in the barn. She took the clean shirt she had washed for Benji, the only truly clean cloth she had, and tore it into strips. She dipped one in the cool water and began to gently, painstakingly, clean the blood from Jed's face. He winced and tried to pull away, but he was too weak. "Be still," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. "It's all right. I'm just cleaning it. Be still now." She worked for what felt like hours. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of it. She folded another strip of cloth into a thick pad to press against the gash to stop the bleeding. When it had slowed to a sluggish ooze, she bandaged his head with the remaining strips, her knots clumsy but tight. She managed to get his heavy arms over her shoulders and, with strength she didn't know she possessed, half dragged, half walked him to his bedroll. He collapsed onto it, his body limp, and was lost to the darkness of unconsciousness again. And so began the long days of silence and waiting. The barn became a hospital, a sanctuary sealed off from the world. Etta's life shrank to the small, essential tasks of survival. She sat vigil by his side, her ears attuned to every shift in his breathing, when a fever took him on the second day, a dry, burning heat that made his skin feel like fire and brought muttered, nonsensical words to his lips. She did not panic. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, hour after hour. She dribbled water from the ladle between his cracked lips, whispering encouragement, pleading with him to swallow. Just a little. "Jed, you have to drink just a little more." She was his nurse, his guard, his lifeline. Benji became her silent accomplice. The boy, having seen her stand against the monsters in the night, now followed her with a quiet, unwavering devotion. He fetched fresh water when the bucket was low. He sat by the barn door, a small, silent sentry, and would report in a whisper if anyone even walked by on the main street. He shared his scavenged apples with her, pushing them into her hand when she forgot to eat. The town left them utterly alone. Agnes must have known there had been a fight. The bounty hunter Kane and Cletus's crew had vanished overnight, but no one came to ask. No sheriff appeared to investigate. It was as if Sanabeno had collectively decided that whatever happened in Jed Holt's world was his own violent business, and they wanted no part of it. Their silence was not a comfort. It was a judgment. They had been walled off. During the long, quiet hours, Etta watched Jed sleep. She saw him not as the silent, intimidating stranger from the train, but as a man. She saw the lines of exhaustion and pain etched around his eyes. She saw the silver threads in his dark hair and beard. She saw a scar that cut through his left eyebrow and another that puckered the skin on his forearm. These were the maps of a hard life, and she found herself wanting to know the stories behind them. He had shielded her with his body, with his silence, with his will. Now, she would shield him with her care. She was not playing wife. She was repaying a debt so profound it could never be spoken of. It could only be shown. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She awoke from a light, fitful doze to find his forehead cool and damp with sweat. His breathing was deeper, more even. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She slumped against the post, the tension of the past days draining out of her, leaving her feeling hollow and weak. Later that afternoon, she was changing his bandage when his eyes flickered open. This time, they were clear. They were focused. They were looking right at her. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her tired face, the gentle way her fingers worked with the cloth. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. She held the ladle of water to his lips, and this time, he drank, his throat working. He lay back, his eyes still on her. The silence stretched, filled with the soft sounds of the barn. He had been to the edge of a dark and quiet place, and she had been the one to pull him back. His first coherent thought was of the one constant in the fog of pain and fever. "You still here?" he rasped, the words barely audible. The question was so simple, yet it held the weight of the entire world. He wasn't asking if she was physically present in the barn. He was asking if she had stayed, after the fight, after the blood, after seeing the full, brutal cost of sheltering her. Had she run Etta put down the water ladle? She looked at his face, so pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, and a feeling she couldn't name swelled in her chest. It was more than gratitude, deeper than loyalty. It was a fierce, protective tenderness. She reached out and took his hand. It was large and calloused, but it felt terribly fragile in her own. She held it firmly, letting him feel the steady strength in her grip. "I ain't leaving," she said, her voice low and certain. "Not unless you make me." His fingers tightened around hers, a faint but definite pressure, a flicker of something relief. Understanding passed through his pale eyes. He said nothing more, but he didn't have to. The connection between them had been forged in violence and was now being tempered in the quiet crucible of healing. He closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. But this time, it was a true, healing rest. And she did not let go of his hand. While Jed slept, Benji found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a smooth, wide plank of wood. He sat in the corner of the barn, his small brow furrowed in concentration, and began to draw. He worked for hours, his small tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth, completely absorbed in his task. The next day, when Jed was awake for a longer stretch, able to sit up and drink a thin broth Etta had made, Benji approached the bedroll. He was shy, a rare thing for the boy, and held the plank of wood clutched to his chest. "This is for you," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor. He held it out. Jed took the plank. On it, drawn in the bold, simple lines of a child, was a picture. On the left was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a wide-brimmed hat. In the middle was a woman with long hair and a dress, and she was smiling. On the right was a small boy, holding the woman's hand. They were standing in front of a barn, and above them, a friendly-looking sun with rays like the spokes of a wheel shone down on them. It was a picture of a family. It was a picture of peace. Etta looked at the drawing, and her throat grew thick. It was a child's simple, heartfelt prayer, a depiction of a world without bounty hunters or cruel fathers, a world where the three of them belonged together. Jed stared at the drawing for a long time, his expression unreadable. He ran a thumb over the rough charcoal lines. Then he looked at Benji, and a hint of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. "It's good work, son," he said, his voice still rough but clear. He looked around, his gaze falling on the wall of the stall that formed the back of his sickbed. "Put it up," he said to Etta, "right there, where I can see it," using a bent nail she found on the floor. Etta hung the drawing on the wooden wall beside his bed. It was a crude, simple thing, charcoal on wood, but it transformed the dusty stall. It made it a home, and there it stayed, a silent testament to the family that had been born in the aftermath of a bloody night, a promise of peace drawn by the hand of a child. The days that followed were quiet, stitched together by the slow, painful rhythm of healing. Jed's strength returned in increments, measured not in hours, but in small, hard-won victories. First, it was the ability to sit up without the world spinning into a gray fog, then to stand, leaning heavily on a post, his jaw set against the wave of dizziness. Finally, to walk, his first steps a slow, deliberate shuffle from his bedroll to the barn door and back. Etta was his shadow, his silent support. She never hovered, never fussed. Her care was as practical and unadorned as the man himself. She made a thin broth from the last of the bacon and some wild onions Benji found, and made sure he drank it. She kept his bandage clean, her touch becoming more confident, less hesitant with each passing day. She did not speak of the fight, nor of the men who had come in the night. That violence was a sealed room, and the door was closed. Their world now was the barn, the slow passage of the sun across the dusty floor, and the quiet work of mending a broken body. The town continued its silent quarantine. When their meager supplies ran low, Etta would walk to the general store, a small list clutched in her hand. The storekeeper would fill her order without a word, taking her coins and giving back change with an air of detached civility. The women she passed on the boardwalk would offer a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Their eyes skittering away from hers, they no longer whispered about her. The fight had silenced the gossip, replacing it with a wary, fearful respect. She was the woman from the barn, the one who had stood with a shotgun against 3 men. She was no longer a curiosity. She was a danger, an unknown quantity, and they gave her a wide berth. Etta didn't mind. Their distance was a wall that protected the fragile peace she was building. A week turned into 2. The deep gash on Jed's temple closed, healing into a raw, red scar that he would carry forever. He began to move more freely, his innate strength pushing back against the weakness injury had imposed. He would spend hours just outside the barn door, in the patch of sun, his hands working to repair a broken piece of harness or sharpen a knife, his movements slow and methodical as he rebuilt not just the leather and steel, but the sinew and muscle in his own arms. Benji, who had been a ghost in the days immediately following the attack, slowly returned to himself. He seemed to have made a silent pact with Etta. He was her scout, her little provider. One afternoon, he came running into the barn, his face alight with a discovery of monumental importance, his cupped hands held out before him. "Etta, look," he whispered, as if he were carrying treasure. Inside his hands were 3 small, pale brown eggs, still warm. "There's a hen," he explained breathlessly. "A wild one. She made a nest in the tall grass behind the old water trough. She's got more. For Etta. Those 3 eggs were more precious than gold. They were a sign of life, of sustenance, of a future that extended beyond the next meal of beans. They were a gift from the parched land, a small miracle of hope. It was later that same day, as the afternoon sun bled into a liquid gold that filled the air and cast long, soft shadows, that she took a small wicker basket Benji had found and went to the nest. The air was warm and still, filled with the lazy buzz of insects and the sweet, dry smell of hay. She found the nest easily, a small, perfect cup of dried grass tucked away in the weeds. There were 4 more eggs. She took 2, leaving the others for the hen, and placed them gently in her basket. As she stood up, she saw Jed. He was 50 yards away, standing by the dilapidated fence that marked the edge of the livery property. He had discarded his shirt in the heat, and his back was to her. The bandage was gone from his head, but his left hand and wrist were still wrapped in a strip of her torn cloth. He was testing a loose fence post, his good hand gripping the wood, his shoulders and back tensing as he put his weight against it. He was seeing what his body could still do, finding the limits of his recovery. She watched him for a long moment. The golden light caught the lines of his scarred back, the coiled strength in his shoulders. He was still not the man he had been, but he was getting there. He was solid. He was real. He was here. All the words the town had spoken, all the warnings and judgments, seemed to whisper to her on the warm breeze. They had called her trouble. They had called her ruin. They had looked at her and seen a storm, a disaster waiting to happen to any man foolish enough to stand in her path. And they had been wrong. With the basket of warm eggs on her arm, Etta began to walk toward him. She moved without a sound, her bare feet soft on the dusty ground. He must have heard her or sensed her, because he stopped pushing against the post and turned, watching her approach. His face was unreadable. His pale eyes narrowed slightly against the setting sun. He just stood and waited. She stopped a few feet from him. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could see the dark, ugly bruise that was only now beginning to fade on his chest, where one of Cletus's men must have kicked him. It was a map of the price he had paid for her. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, as gentle as the evening light. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of a past truth. "The town warned you," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Agnes, the man by the corral, all of them, they warned you I was too pure, that I'd ruin you." Jed did not speak. He did not deny it. He did not offer any words of comfort or contradiction. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and intense. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the terrified girl from the train or the diligent nurse by his bedside, but as the woman who stood before him now, bathed in golden light, holding a basket of eggs, her gaze clear and unafraid. He looked and he listened. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they had been through the shared darkness under his coat, the whispers on the street, the rage of the sandstorm, the violence in the night, the quiet healing. His silence was an invitation for her to say what needed to be said. She took a step closer, until she was standing directly before him. The wicker basket bumped against her leg. Slowly, she lifted her free hand, the one not holding the eggs, and reached out. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gently, reverently, placed her palm flat against his chest, right over the faded purple and yellow shadow of the bruise. His skin was warm, his heartbeat a slow, solid, steady thump beneath her hand. It was the surest rhythm she had ever known. "But you stayed," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She felt the muscle in his chest tense under her touch. "And I ruined nothing." Her gaze dropped from his eyes to her hand on his chest. This was the truth she had been searching for. The town saw her innocence as a destructive force, a fragile thing that would break a hard man like him. But they were wrong. Her innocence hadn't been the thing that mattered. His steadfastness had. She looked back up at him, her heart in her eyes, laying her soul bare before him with a courage that dwarfed the kind it took to hold a shotgun. "I only wanted to give myself to someone who stayed." The words were a quiet confession, a vulnerable and absolute offering. It was not about purity or sin, not about contracts or ruin. It was about choice. It was the story of a girl who had been offered up as payment, who had been hunted as property, and who was now, for the first time in her life, claiming the right to choose. She was choosing the man who had not left when the world told him to run. Jed's gaze softened. The hard, stony mask he wore seemed to dissolve in the warm light, revealing something underneath that was raw and real. He did not speak. Words were not his language. Instead, he slowly lifted his good hand, the one that wasn't bandaged, and covered her hand where it rested on his chest. He didn't grip it, didn't pull it away. He just held it there, his large, calloused hand completely engulfing hers. A silent, powerful affirmation. He had heard her, and he was still here. He was staying. The world seemed to pause, held in the amber of the setting sun. Etta's hand was on Jed's chest, his hand covering hers. His heartbeat a steady, solid rhythm beneath them both. For a long moment, that was all there was, the warmth of his skin, the beat of his heart, and the weight of her confession hanging in the silent air. It was a truth so fragile she feared it might shatter if either of them spoke. Jed did not speak. He simply held her hand there against his heart for another beat. 2, 3, a silent acknowledgement of the gift she had offered. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted his hand, his fingers gently entwined with hers. He did not let go. He turned, his back to the setting sun, and began to walk, leading her away from the barn, away from the edge of the town, toward the open, empty land that stretched out to meet the horizon. She walked beside him, their joined hands a new and unspoken covenant between them. The basket of eggs, forgotten, bumped gently against her hip. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of fear and doubt for so long, felt strangely calm, strangely empty. She had said the truest thing she had ever said, and the world had not ended. The man beside her had not run. He was leading her somewhere. They walked past the last of San Abeno's tired, leaning structures, their path a faint track in the dust. The town fell away behind them. Its sounds the distant, tinny piano from the saloon, the shout of a man calling it a day fading into the vast silence of the desert. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower, and the light softened, turning the dust to a fine, pink powder and the sky into a canvas of deepening purple and orange. Jed led her to a place she hadn't noticed before, a small stretch of land where the harshness of the desert seemed to relent. A low, meandering fence made of old, silvered wood marked a long-forgotten property line. And along that fence, growing in stubborn, cheerful clumps, was a profusion of small, yellow wildflowers. They weren't grand or beautiful like the roses in her mother's garden back home. They were tough, resilient things, their petals bright as spilled gold dust against the red earth, a testament to the fierce and tenacious nature of life in a hard place. He stopped when they reached the fence and turned to face her, still holding her hand. He let his gaze drift over the field of flowers, then back to her face. He had brought her to a place of quiet, unexpected beauty, a secret garden on the edge of nothing. He had chosen this spot. Etta looked down at their joined hands. His was so much larger than hers, the skin rough with calluses from a life of holding reins and tools and, when needed, weapons. Her hand was smaller, softer, but no longer the unmarked hand of the girl who had stepped off the train. It was a hand that had scrubbed a child's shirt, tended a man's wound, and held the cold, heavy stock of a shotgun. They were different, yet their hands fit together as if they were made for it. She knew this was the moment. The walk was over. He had answered her confession by bringing her here, but the words still needed to be said. The final bricks laid to build this new, unbelievable foundation between them. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and the faint, peppery scent of the wildflowers. She lifted her eyes to his. "I was never someone's wife," she said, her voice a whisper, but clear and steady in the evening quiet. Never someone's woman. She thought of the contract, the white satin dress, the life that had been chosen for her by others. It all felt like a story about a stranger now. But I'd like to be yours. It was a vow, a promise, a complete and total surrender. But a surrender born not of defeat, but of her own sovereign choice. She was not being given. She was giving. A muscle worked in Jed's jaw. He looked at her, and in his pale eyes, she saw a depth of emotion she had never seen before. It was not pity or triumph or possession. It was something quieter, something far more profound. He gently let go of her hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought she had misread everything. But he only raised his hand, the one that was no longer bandaged, to her face. His movements were slow, careful, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. His rough fingertips, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray strand of honey-colored hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His thumb rested for a moment on the curve of her jaw, a touch that was both an anchor and a question. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough murmur, meant only for her. "Not because you're pure," he said, and with those words, he swept away the town's judgment, the label that had been her curse. "Not because you're mine," he continued, and he dismantled the very idea of ownership that had driven her into his protection. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart stop. "But because you chose," he gave her back the one thing the world had tried to steal from her, her own will. He was not accepting her as property, or as a prize, or as a ward to be protected. He was accepting her as an equal, a woman who had looked at the world and at him, and had made a choice. He was honoring that choice. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in Etta's eyes. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a relief so immense it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her soul. She had been seen. For the first time in her life, she felt truly and completely seen for who she was. He saw the tears gather on her lashes, and his expression softened even more. He lowered his head, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She stood her ground, her gaze locked on his, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a wild, soaring anticipation. She closed her eyes. The first touch of his lips was tentative, questioning. It was not the clumsy, forceful kiss of a man taking what he wanted, but the dry, warm pressure of a man accepting what was freely offered. It was the slight scratch of his beard against her soft skin, the scent of dust and leather and man, the solid presence of him filling her world. It was a kiss that tasted of hardship and survival, of silent understanding and shared solitude. She leaned into him, a small, involuntary movement, and his arm came around her waist, drawing her closer. His other hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her hair. The kiss deepened, but there was no hurry, no demand. It was a slow, quiet exploration, a conversation without words. It was the first kiss of her life, and it was nothing like the fumbled, breathless encounters she had read about in forbidden books. It was calm. It was certain. It was right. It was a promise made and a promise received, sealed not with vows before a preacher, but in the fading light, surrounded by the stubborn, beautiful life of the desert. When he finally drew back, the sun had slipped completely below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, velvety indigo. The first star of evening was a sharp, brilliant pinprick of light above them. They stood in the twilight, wrapped in the new, profound silence between them. He did not let her go, and she did not want him to. She rested her head against his chest, her ear over his heart, listening to the steady, reassuring beat. The wind whispered through the yellow wildflowers, a soft, sighing sound. He had heard her. He had answered. And in the vast, lonely expanse of the Arizona Territory, beneath a canopy of emerging stars, a preacher's runaway daughter and a silent, solitary cowboy were no longer alone. Returning to the barn in the deep twilight, the world felt fundamentally changed. The space between them, once filled with the tension of the unknown, was now charged with a quiet, shimmering energy. He did not let go of her hand until they reached the barn door. He didn't need to. The connection, now that it was acknowledged, was a tangible thing, a current that flowed between them even when they were apart. Benji was asleep in his grain bin, a small, peaceful lump in the darkness. The drawing he had made was a pale square on the wall, a silent benediction over their new beginning. Nothing was said of the kiss. Nothing needed to be. Words were for defining boundaries and asking questions. They were past that now. The next morning, a new routine began, born not of necessity and survival, but of partnership. The first test of this new reality came 2 days later. Their supplies were low again. And this time, Jed didn't go into town alone. The blacksmith had, in a gruff gesture of goodwill, gifted Jed a gentle mare that had been left to settle a debt. After Jed checked her temperament, he led the horse to Etta. "She's yours, if you'll have her," he said simply. And so, for the first time, they rode into Sanabeno side by side. Jed on his dark bay, a formidable, silent figure, and Etta on the gentle mare, her back straight, her hands steady on the reins. She did not ride behind him as a follower, or beside him as property. She rode with him as an equal. Her head was held high, not in defiance, but with a quiet, certain dignity. She was no longer hiding in his shadow. She was riding in the light, by his side, and the town, as it always did, was watching. As they rode down the single dusty street, the usual sounds of the town seemed to pause. The man whittling on the porch of the general store stopped, his knife still. The women gossiping on the saloon boardwalk fell silent. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, judgmental quiet of her arrival. It was a silence of re-evaluation, of grudging respect. They saw the change. They saw a girl who was no longer haunted, no longer hunched against the world. They saw a woman. Agnes came to the door of the saloon, a wet rag in her hand, and watched them pass. Her severe expression didn't soften, but the sharp, vindictive glint in her eyes was gone, replaced by a look of neutral, stoic observation. The cattleman who had warned Jed off stood by the livery, smoking a cigarette. As they passed, he took the cigarette from his mouth and gave a slow, single nod. It wasn't a gesture of friendship, but it was one of acknowledgement. He had warned of ruin, and instead, he was witnessing a resurrection. Etta met their gazes. She did not smile, nor did she scowl. She simply looked back, her blue eyes clear and steady. There was no fear left in them, and in the face of her quiet strength, the town's judgment faltered. They had wanted a simple story, a fallen woman, a foolish man, a predictable tragedy. But this was something else. This was a story they didn't know how to tell, and so they fell silent. A few of the women offered small, hesitant smiles, as if recognizing in Etta a resilience they understood in their own lives. They had misjudged her, and in the quiet way of a small, harsh town, they were admitting it. In the days that followed, the barn was transformed. It ceased to be a temporary refuge and began, slowly, to feel like a home. The rhythm of their lives became a quiet, three-part harmony. Jed, his strength fully returned, found work. He was a man who could fix things, and in a town like Sanabeno, there were always things that were broken. He mended the sagging gate on the cattle pen at the edge of town, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a steady, comforting beat in the afternoon heat. He reshod horses for the blacksmith when a freight line came through, his movements around the powerful animals calm and sure. He was earning his keep, but more than that, he was putting down roots, however shallow, in the hard desert soil. Etta, in turn, brought life to the dusty corners of their world. With a few coins Jed gave her, she bought flour, yeast, and salt. The scent of bread baking in her skillet over the open fire became a daily miracle, a warm, yeasty perfume that spoke of nourishment and care. The bread itself was a revelation to Benji, who had lived on scraps and stolen apples for as long as he could remember. He would eat the warm, soft slices with a look of quiet reverence on his face. She mended their clothes with the neat, small stitches of a preacher's daughter, but there was a new strength in her hands, a purpose that went beyond mere duty. And Benji, the small, silent observer, became a boy again. He was no longer a shadow, flitting at the edges of their lives. He was the bright, chaotic center. He chased the wild hen and her new brood of chicks through the tall grass, his high-pitched laughter a sound that Etta realized she had never heard before. He helped Jed, carrying tools and fetching water, his small chest puffed out with pride. He helped Etta, gathering firewood and bringing her the daily treasure of fresh eggs. He was the thread that wove their separate lives into a single, cohesive tapestry. He was their son in all but name. They were a strange, unlikely family. A silent man with a violent past, a runaway girl with a purchased future, and an orphan boy who belonged to no one. But in the quiet sanctuary of the barn, under the vast, indifferent Arizona sky, they belonged to each other. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the clouds in brilliant streaks of rose and gold, Etta stood in the doorway of the barn. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of dust and the faint perfume of the wildflowers by the fence. Inside, Benji was asleep, his small face peaceful in the hay. Outside, Jed was building a small fire for their evening meal. She watched him. He worked with an unhurried, economical grace, arranging the kindling, striking the flint and steel. The spark caught, and a small, hungry flame began to lick at the dry wood. He coaxed it, nurtured it, until it grew into a steady, crackling fire that pushed back the encroaching twilight and cast a warm, dancing glow on his weathered face. She thought back to the first time she had seen him, a large, intimidating silhouette on a rattling train car. She remembered the sheer, animal terror that had driven her to his feet. He had been a refuge, a shield, a silent, inscrutable force that had stood between her and the darkness. She had been so afraid of the men chasing her, afraid of the judgment of the world, and in some ways, afraid of the very man who was protecting her. She looked at him now, his profile strong and calm in the firelight. He was still a man of silence, a man of deep, untapped strength, but he was no longer a stranger, no longer an intimidating force. He was the anchor of her world. He was the man who had stayed. He was the man who had listened not to the world, but to her. He was Jed. He must have felt her eyes on him, because he looked up from the fire. His pale eyes met hers across the small, crackling flames. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face were softened by the firelight. He simply looked at her, waiting. She stepped out of the barn, her bare feet soft in the dust, and walked toward the fire, toward him. The warmth of the flames kissed her face. "I was scared when I met you," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the still evening air. He held her gaze, his expression unchanging, letting her speak her truth. But now, she paused, looking from his face to the small, sturdy home they had made, to the sleeping boy inside, to the vast, star-dusted sky above. The fear was gone. It had been burned away in the fire of the last few weeks, leaving behind something clean and strong. "If you'll still have me, I ain't scared no more." The words were a final, quiet declaration. It was an acknowledgement of her past fear, a statement of her present courage, and a vulnerable, hopeful question for their future. Jed did not answer. He didn't need to. Words were a clumsy, inadequate tool for the language he spoke. Instead, he simply lifted his hand, palm up, and held it out to her across the flames. It was not a command. It was an invitation. It was a promise. It was the answer to every question she had ever asked, and every question she would ever have. And she walked forward, around the crackling fire, and placed her hand in his. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.